Hello everybody, I am Pusei Eugene and I am a journalist. This is the second of the news analysis series by Norikorea.net. Today I will explain about the conflict in the Taiwan Strait. I will explain to you by using some slides. Recently, there are media reports that talk about how China may invade Taiwan in the near future. I will explain how we should interpret these reports. The hottest topic right now is the Financial Times, which had the scoop on July 1st, which was about the US-Japan joint military training. The two countries were secretly conducting a simulation on how they would respond in times of war in the Taiwan Strait. The scoop in the Financial Times revealed that the U.S. military and Japanese SDF have been preparing for the possible strike in the Taiwan Strait and have been conducting joint military training. There has been a lot of speculation that the tensions in the Taiwan Strait are rising. In March this year, the commander of U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific Ocean said at the U.S. Senate that at the earliest, within the next 6 years, there may be a military action toward Taiwan and China may invade. His statement sent a shockwave, and it was reported widely throughout the world. Ever since then, there have been talks about this possible strike, and speculations have been growing. It is true that tensions have been rising, and the possibility of military actions is getting stronger recently. The newspapers also reported as such. In early June, China sent 28 fighter planes and bombers to Taiwan's air defense zone, and in response, the Taiwanese Air Force also flew a fighter plane to send warnings. The Chinese military is getting more active like this, so it is a fact that China is intimidating Taiwan by launching into military actions. Is this trend going to lead to China's invasion into Taiwan within, say, 6 years, like the U.S. commander said? Is it possible? I agree that a country should never exaggerate actual threat in any way. However, if we misread China's intention and prepare to strike back, if a war erupted, the result would be worse. In that sense, it is important to interpret China's intentions in an impartial manner. For instance, this is not just me, but there is a top officer of the U.S. forces who spoke at the U.S. Senate. Joint Chief of Staff General Mark Milley said on June 17th in the Senate hearing that the possibility of China invading Taiwan in the near future is low. Even if China intended to, it has a ways to go to develop the capability to conduct military operations to seize Taiwan. Furthermore, there is little intent right now or motivations to do it militarily. This is the statement made by the top official of the U.S. forces. You may question his statement. Earlier, I introduced another statement by the commander of the U.S. forces that speculated China's invasion of Taiwan within the next 6 years, and said that this is why media widely reported it. But someone higher than the commander tried to smother it by saying China has no capabilities or motivations, and the possibility of China seizing Taiwan is small. I personally agree with the Joint Chief of Staff. I will explain why the possibility is small. People often talk about Russia taking over the Crimea Peninsula, where there is a mention of the possibility of China's invasion into Taiwan. Crimea was annexed by the Russian Federation in 2014. And people often draw a parallel between China and Russia. But there is one definite difference between the two examples of Crimea and Taiwan. In the case of the Crimea Peninsula, nearly 60% of the people who live there are Russian ethnicity. Russia held a referendum and decided it would annex Crimea. However, in the case of Taiwan, about 90% of the people in the polls last August opposed unification with China. And of course, 90% opposed military threat. Some 86.1% wish to maintain the status quo in China-Taiwan relations. So the Polish poll showed the supermajority of Taiwanese people did not wish for the unification. What this means is that it is extremely difficult to govern Taiwan within the support from the Taiwanese people, even if China could take over with military oppression. The Chinese government obviously understands this consequence. To make matters worse, China faced difficulties governing the people amidst issues surrounding Hong Kong and Uyghur. It is even more difficult to take over Taiwan with military oppression in this sense. Another reason is economy. For the current Xi Jinping government, the economic growth is the highest priority. This is the reason why the Communist China lasted for 100 years, since the USSR collapsed and the Cold War ended. But if China did invade Taiwan with military aggression, the U.S. would break the silence. There's a strong possibility that the U.S.-China war would erupt. At the same time, there are other nations such as Southeast Asian nations that face territorial conflict with China. Of course, Japan also faces territorial issue, and so does the EU. When you look at China's economic growth, the nation has increased wealth by international trade. This is the graph that shows China's trade partners. The best trade partners are EU and the US, followed by Southeast Asian nations, Hong Kong, Japan, and then South Korea. If China seized Taiwan, trade with the US, EU, and Japan would be suspended. And this would cause the resources to dry out for China that must govern such a vast population and a vast land. For China, it would be like suffocating itself. That is why the possibility of it resorting to military actions is extremely low. For these reasons, as I said earlier, the top official of the U.S. forces is saying there are no motivations or grounds for China to take military action at this time. If this is the case, why China is strengthening military actions and trying to intimidate Taiwan? There are reasons for this. We can see them looking at China's stance against Taiwan. There are 3 points to make. One is that China has always insisted that Taiwan is China's inseparable territory. Taiwan used to agree that Taiwan and China are one country, and the Communist China is the system that represents Taiwan. And Taiwan is called the Republic of China. The Nationalist Party lost to the Communist Party during the Civil War and established Taiwan. The Nationalist Party resisted the Communist China by saying it would someday govern China as a whole. So both were saying the two states are one country. Currently, China is the only one saying that. The second point is that China aims to unify Taiwan, but peacefully, and that it aims to run one country, two systems, just like Hong Kong. Xi Jinping makes this statement repeatedly. It would aim to unify peacefully, but as soon as the outside forces such as the U.S. interferes militarily, or if there was resistance within Taiwan that seeks Taiwanese independence, China would not hesitate to take any military actions. But why, then, China is increasing military threat? Let's look at reason number 3. We talked about how the Taiwanese government is run by the Democratic Progressive Party, strongly seeking independence, compared to the Nationalist Party. From this perspective, China is trying to contain Taiwan and its Democratic Progressive Party against seeking or declaring its own independence. Another aspect is the move to contain the U.S. To begin with, the U.S.-China relations started feeling awkward under the Trump administration. They established a law where the high-ranking officials of both governments to visit each other, which was suspended until then. But they started this exchange under Trump. Until then, the U.S. practically respected China's one-nation policy. This is why the U.S. for a long time never pursued official diplomatic exchanges with Taiwanese government. However, under the Trump administration, they sought more exchanges with cabinet-level officials of Taiwan. China showed resistance to that and tried to contain the U.S. by escalating military actions. Moreover, the Trump administration exported weapons to Taiwan. They drew agreement to export massive amounts of weapons, such as missiles. This is the third point where China tried to contain the U.S. by military action, calling it the outside force, and that it is interfering with its internal ordeal. We should look at China's recent military activities not as an intention to immediately seize Taiwan, but to contain the United States or Taiwanese independence. In fact, I am not the only one thinking like this. A former high-ranking official of the U.S. government also says the same. Joseph Nye, former Deputy Defense Minister and Assistant Secretary of Defense, contributed his opinion piece to the Yomiuri Shimbun that the economic and ecological interdependency reduces the probability of a real Cold War, much less a hot one, between the U.S. and China, because both countries have an incentive to cooperate in a number of areas. A war means both countries would be choking themselves to death, so he says it is hard to imagine any war is imminent. Another important point he is making is that miscalculation is always possible. and some see the danger of accidentally leading into a catastrophe.
お互いの意図を読み違えてしまったり、あるいは偶発的な形で軍事衝突が起きてしまってですね、それが結果的にどんどんエスカレートしていって、お互い破滅へとこう進めてしまう危険があるということを。
Reasonably considering, the two countries would not go into a war. However, if you look back at history, miscalculations and misreading each other led to numerous wars. This is what he was pointing to. Let's look at the map. Let's say a war broke out in the Taiwan Strait. This would lead to a war between the US and China. Then if it did escalate, this would not be a fire on the other side of the river for Japan. You can see on the map that Yonaguni Island is only 100 plus kilometers away from Taiwan. If a war broke out, Japan would not be able to stay out of it. What is really scary is that, as Joseph Nye said, they'd fly fighter planes, or the U.S. would send its aircraft carriers through the strait with the political intention to militarily threat the other country, even if they are not intended to wage a war. China would then respond to this by flying a fighter plane, and the intimidations would get more frequent. Even without any intentions to wage a war, they could easily miscalculate or misread one's threats as a real attack. One day, the other would strike back. This sort of mistake would lead to accidental clash. The risk of accidental clash is extremely increasing. Once the war erupted, soldiers would die, and the sense of nationalism would get ignited. They could not pull back any longer. That is really dangerous. But this is how media have been reporting. People hear that China could be invading Taiwan within 6 years, as media reports say, and the two nations prepare for the day. The close contacts would escalate, and chances of military actions would increase. What is even more dangerous is that the U.S. is trying to deploy missiles in islands like Amami, Okinawa, Miyako, Ishigaki, Yonaguni, and Taiwan, as well as the Philippines, in preparation for the war with China. The U.S. is building a fortress by spreading missile launch bases against China or Chinese battleship in the East China Sea. With Japan's SDF on Amami, Miyako, or Ishigaki Islands, Japan would be able to launch missiles. Just the other day, SDF and the U.S. military conducted a joint training to deploy missile stations in Amami Island. This type of training is conducted while the tension is rising in the Taiwan Strait. The military tension is rising, and this poses a danger to accidental war erupting. Considering this, we must critically look at the media reports that only picked up the statement by the commander of the U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific Ocean on March 9th. This is pouring oil into fire. But the background of this statement made during the Senate hearing is that this was the place to discuss military budget for the next 5 to 6 years. That is why the commander was summoned to give feedback regarding the situations in the Indo-Pacific Ocean. Obviously, as a military officer, he intended to secure sufficient budget. For that, he exaggerated the military threat of China in the region. In the end, it is important to not just look at one statement, but considering the context. That is why the top official, Milley, tried to smother it. I expect this issue would be reported in the media widely in the future. What we have to think then, let's look at the map again. If a war erupted in the Taiwan Strait, even accidentally, as I said earlier, the U.S. is already planning to deploy missiles in the southwestern islands, and China has already seen the southwestern nations as targets. In that case, not only Taiwan, but the southwestern islands would also turn into a battleground. We must look at history and remember Okinawa. During the World War II, Okinawa was sacrificed to stall the enemies before they get to the mainland Japan. They were sacrificed in order to keep the mainland safe. As the history shows, Japan sacrificed Okinawa, where so many Okinawans perished in this battle. We should not repeat what happened to Okinawa, or should we not allow Okinawa to be another battleground? For that, we must think what we should do with the conflict in the Taiwan Strait. I would like to continue discussing this issue in the future. Thank you very much for listening.